This video was brought to you by Nebula. For the past few decades or so, Japan and China have been stuck in a quiet territorial dispute over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, which sit just off the coast of Taiwan and are de facto controlled by Japan. Despite the fact that the islands have literally no strategic value, there has been an uptick in tensions recently as part of a wider escalation over maritime disputes in the region. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the history of this dispute, why tensions are on the up, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with some context. The Diaoyu Islands, as they're known in China, or the Senkaku Islands, as they're known in Japan, are a group of small uninhabited islands, about 7 square kilometers in total, that lie just off the northeastern coast of Taiwan. Now, they're technically under the administration of Japan, but they've been claimed by China, Taiwan, and Japan. However, the main beef that we're going to be talking about today is between Japan and China. Now, both countries have different historical accounts of the island's sovereignty, which makes it tricky to determine the actual history of the islands. Because while the islands have only recently become the subject of major diplomatic disputes, China argues that its claims to the islands go all the way back as early as 1403 during the Ming Dynasty, using documents from the era as proof. The Chinese also claim that the islands were subsequently mentioned in maps dating between 1562 and 1767. However, Japan's claim rests on the basis that the islands were terra nullis, i.e. they were unoccupied and unclaimed, before it incorporated them into their territory in 1895, the same year that China conceded Taiwan to Japan following the First Sino-Japanese War. They argue that the islands were carefully surveyed before they were claimed as part of Japanese territory. Regardless, following World War II, the islands came under US administration as part of Okinawa, before being handed back to Japan in the American-Japanese 1972 Okinawa Reversion Agreement. Now, Japan claims that this only affirms that the islands are part of Japanese territory, particularly in the modern post-war era. However, China argues that Japan should have returned the islands to China when they returned Taiwan to it after World War II. Now, clearly neither side can agree, and as such, both countries have invoked international law to back their claims. And both countries have created some pretty dodgy-looking websites detailing their claim. The Chinese website, which features a virtual tour of their Diaoyu Dao Museum if you're interested, claims that the islands are, quote, an inseparable part of the Chinese territory, going on to describe them as China's inherent territory in all historical and legal terms, and China enjoys indisputable sovereignty over it. The Japanese website is similarly unequivocal, stating that there's no doubt that the Senkaku Islands are clearly an inherent part of the territory of Japan, in light of the historical facts and based on international law. Anyway, these websites clearly haven't solved anything, even despite flashy graphics and tours, because tensions have only escalated in recent years. Most notably in 2010, when a Chinese fishing boat in the area crashed into 2 Japanese patrol boats, and the captain was subsequently arrested by Japanese authorities. After a diplomatic stalemate that lasted several days, and during which China cancelled an official's visit to Japan and banned the export of rare earth minerals to Japan, the captain was eventually released without charge. That issue in particular might have been resolved, but this dispute sparked a subsequent flurry of naval action in the area, with civilians from Japan, China, and Taiwan all sailing to the seas around the island, and an increase in nationalist sentiment in both China and Japan. Then in 2012, Tokyo's right-wing governor announced that they would be using public money to buy back the islands from their private Japanese owners. Now, to avoid this controversial plan, the Japanese government instead arranged to buy 3 of the islands, but unsurprisingly, this still annoyed China. So at this point in the video, the question probably is why everyone cares so much about some islands I previously said were strategically unimportant. Well, the whole argument is mainly symbolic. As I said, the islands themselves have little military or economic value, and they're not suitable for supporting either civilian or military activities. In the 1970s, there were some suggestions that the islands might have oil reserves nearby, which Japan claims is the only reason that China really started showing interest in the first place. However, evidence of potential oil reserves was later disproved, and one Japanese vice admiral even admitted they are just junk rocks with no strategic value. So if the islands really are just a bunch of worthless rocks, why does everyone care about them so much? Well, the answer can largely be put down to the emotional significance of the islands, with both sides admitting the islands have important symbolic value. For China, Japan's possession of the islands is symbolic of an era where Japan had the upper hand over China. And as this is no longer the case today, China has been seen to assert itself as a military and strategic power as it's grown economically. And it's not just about the history either. Japan conceding the islands would mark a symbolic shift in the Sino-Japanese relationship dynamic. And for China, this would represent a Japanese admission that China had overtaken them as the more powerful state in the region. Now, the same is true for Japan. A Japanese defense minister admitted that the islands were a nationalistic symbol and not a strategic military or economic stronghold. Rather than that, it was about, quote, honor. For Japan and other countries in the region, though, there's also a worry that this might set a precedent. If Japan gives up these islands, then it might encourage China to more actively assert itself in other territorial claims, potentially destabilizing the region. But why does this matter now, over 10 years on from the original conflict? Well, there are broadly two reasons. Firstly, as the great power competition between China and the US heats up, and other Asian countries become increasingly anxious about China's regional aspirations, it's stoking nationalist sentiment in both China and Japan, straining relationships and reawakening dormant disagreements. Secondly, there's also been an uptick in tensions around the islands recently. Judging by reports, it looks like the PLA have been sending more ships into the area over the last few months or so. And tensions hit a new high last week when there was a standoff between Chinese and Japanese vessels after two Chinese ships trailed a Japanese sailing boat in the region and eventually ended up coming within a few miles of one of the islands. You get the idea then. The wider escalation in Indo-Pacific tensions has been accompanied by an uptick in maritime altercations, which in turn has reignited the dispute over the Senkaku Islands. This is just one of many geopolitical tensions right now, though. China is an obvious example of an actor whose decisions seem increasingly troubling at the moment. Ultimately, that's why it's important that we understand these nations and their problems in a detailed way. And a good way to learn more is through Polymatter's brilliant series, China Actually. This show runs through issues from Chinese censorship and their nuclear policy to how the country has come to dominate rare earth mineral production, something we've discussed before in TLDR videos. If that sounds good to you, then you can watch this series alongside a load of others which perfectly complement TLDR videos exclusively on our streaming service, Nebula, where you can also find a bunch of TLDR content too. That's because we post all of our videos ad-free on Nebula, as well as sharing some of our videos there before they ever make it to YouTube. Not only that, we also release hours worth of content only on Nebula every month, from extended editions of our show The Daily Briefing to exclusive explainers and behind the scenes clips. And the good news is that all of this, TLDR content, exclusive documentary series, and a bunch of other brilliant creators are available at a great price. That's because if you sign up using our link in the description, then you can get Nebula for less than £2 a month. So help out the channel and learn more by signing up to Nebula. Thanks for your support.